Ballots are still being counted, but if the primary is any indicator, Seattle voters are looking to shake things up. We'll talk about who's moving on to the November election, what they might need to win, and what it all says about Seattle politics. Seattle Times reporter David Kroman is here to explain. But first, let's get you caught up. Small businesses that have been vandalized will get more help from the city. In Seattle, business owners can already receive up to $3,000 grants to make repairs. Now, stores that want to implement new security measures can apply to get reimbursed up to $6,000. Applications are open through December or until the funding runs out. Cannabis sales across Washington are down again for the fourth year in a row, according to state officials. Revenue in the first quarter of this year totaled $277 million. That's $100 million less than the all-time high in 2021. Prices for cannabis have dropped compared to pre-pandemic levels, likely because of an oversupply. And King County's crackdown on unlicensed food vendors is ramping up, with inspectors shutting down 122 food carts so far this year. That's more than all the illegal food vendors shut down in total for last year. County health officials say there's been a surge in unlicensed food businesses, especially near tourist attractions and stadiums. Check back for more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. Primary election results won't be official until August 20th, but we've seen some clear leads so far. Challenger Katie Wilson leads Mayor Bruce Harrell by 8%. Erica Evans leads over incumbent Ann Davison in the Seattle City Attorney race by 21%. And Dion Foster leads County Council President Sarah Nelson by 22% in that city council race. It's looking dicey for some of the incumbents, but a lot can happen between now and November. Seattle Times reporter David Kroman reports on City Hall. He's here to break down what we know so far and what it says about Seattle voters. David, really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So did things go the way you were expecting this primary election cycle in Seattle?
I wasn't expecting them in any way. I genuinely, usually when you go into elections, you kind of have some guess of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that guess is right. I actually, going into this, did not have a guess. So I was open to any and all possibilities, which in and of itself was kind of exciting, actually. It's probably the least predictable election for me.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe a little more fun being surprised. Yeah. Let's dive into the mayoral race. David, what's your read on what happened there?
If we were surprised, it was in this race, because Mayor Harrell, I think for a lot of this year, came in feeling sort of inevitable in some ways. You know, he started off 2025, he racked up a ton of endorsements, including from a pretty broad base of people. You know, he had business backing him, but he also had a lot of labor backing him. He had Representative Pramila Jayabal backing him. You know, he had this very broad base of endorsements. There were not really any serious challengers coming in. And then, you know, Katie Wilson is known if you have worked in City Hall, but outside of City Hall is really pretty unknown. And so, you know, I think this one was the surprise, but I think it maybe became less of a surprise when we saw the results out of New York with Zohran Mamdani unseating former Governor Cuomo. And of course, you know, there's a lot of nuances there, but there was some maybe hint that there was a general dissatisfaction with anybody who was seen as being establishment. And in Seattle politics, nobody is as establishment as Mayor Harrell. He's been in City Hall for a really long time. He's well connected. I think there are a lot of reasons why, you know, that we can spend a long time talking about for why we saw the results that we did on Tuesday. But I do think Katie captured a sort of anti-establishment sentiment in Seattle that is proving to be real.
Let's talk about her pitch and whether or not she's going to need to fine-tune it for the general election.
Her pitch has been around affordability. That has been really what she's been running hard on. And we could spend forever talking about whether she is offering real solutions to that problem, but she is talking about it in a way that perhaps Harrell's team did not sort of capture on. I think in 23 and 21, in those last two election cycles, those are really about public safety. And that was a strong issue for Harrell that he has really platformed for basically all of his time in City Hall. And so, you know, he came in saying he's going to go to the police department and bring down crime. And that was powerful at the time. I think what Katie is getting at, though, is maybe public safety is not the number one issue this time around. It is certainly, I think, still important to people, but I do think the cost of just everything and doing anything in Seattle is really becoming more and more of a priority for voters, and she has spoken to that, and apparently effectively. I think there's a little bit of a catch-22 also, which is the police department is improved. Crime is not as bad as it used to be. And, Harrell is looking at those and saying, hey, look, I'm doing what I said I wanted to do. So you should reward me for that. But there might be the inverse, which is people aren't quite as concerned about them as they were maybe 4 years ago. And now they're turning their attention to, the fact that it's really expensive to rent or buy food or really do anything in Seattle. And Katie's offering a narrative around that.
What will she have to answer for, though? Because I wonder, this is just a primary. There's a lot of questions from voters, and there'll be debates between now and the general election. What kinds of things will she really have to answer about herself?
I think the number one thing is, can she be mayor? She's been around City Hall for a long time, but as an advocate for very specific issues and people and things. And being mayor is more than that. Harrell this whole time has been saying, do we really want somebody with as little experience as her running the city? And I think that's going to come up a lot more. The other piece is, it does go back to public safety, which is during 2020, Katie was a voice, maybe not the main voice, but was a voice in favor of cutting the police department's budget. I think there was some nuance to her views. It was, we should be spending this money on human services and social workers and alternatives. But, top line, she was a pro cutting the police department's budget voice at the time. And, again, Harrell's camp is really trying everything they can to bring that up and point that out to people and saying, we can't go back to those politics. I think there was some of that in the primary, but I think that's going to get a lot more intense in the general election.
What about Harrell? What needs to happen for his campaign during the general election messaging?
There are people who are paid lots and lots of money to answer these questions. So I don't want to say that this is a definitive answer here. But, I've talked to people in the previous days about kind of their read on what Harrell needs to do. He needs to sort of give a very clear message about what another 4 years of Harrell would result in. If I'm elected, these are the things I'm going to do for you. I think a lot of the campaign so far has been pointing to things that he feels he's done well in his first term. And then also when talking about Katie Wilson has pointed to, here are these issues that she supported in the past. So it's all sort of retrospective in a lot of ways. And I think what we're hearing from voters, and perhaps why they went with Katie Wilson, is they want a vision for the future. They want somebody who's telling them, yes, I feel your pain. I hear your problems. Here's where we're going to go.
Really interesting, David. Let's talk about the city attorney race. Very interesting race there. What happened with Ann Davison?
I think what happened there is the reality of Seattle politics has probably caught up to Ann Davison. She ran for statewide office as a Republican, for the lieutenant governor as a Republican in 2020, the year before she ran for city attorney and won. And, she has since really distanced herself from the Republican Party. She says she's never voted for Donald Trump. She has endorsements from some pretty high-profile moderate Democrats like Adam Smith and Christine Gregoire. And yet, I think the anger and frustration toward the Republican Party and President Donald Trump in particular from Seattle voters is powerful enough that is a really strong current that she's rowing against. She can say as much as she wants that she is no longer, she's not affiliated with that party in that way. But the fact of the matter is Donald Trump had already been in office for an entire term when she decided to run as a Republican. And I think voters are noticing that and taking that to heart.
Even City Council President Sarah Nelson is way behind her opponent, David Dion Foster. Is Nelson in trouble here?
Yeah, Nelson is in trouble, which isn't to say that this is the end of the race necessarily. But I think the results are not great for Bruce Harrell, but that is going to be a real race. The results are borderline catastrophic for Sarah Nelson and Ann Davison because they are down significantly. It really was a two-person race in these, so it's not like there's a field that split the vote necessarily. Her opponent has well over 50%, and anytime your opponent has 50% in a primary, you are in for a long and difficult fight. I think this race is kind of the most interesting because it's hard to come up with a very specific narrative in the way that, Ann Davison has a history as a Republican. That was always going to be a problem in Seattle politics. Sarah Nelson doesn't. I mean, she's a kind of centrist, moderate Democrat by all appearances. What Sarah Nelson is, though, is the, I think, figurehead and symbol of this current Seattle City Council. She is its council president. She campaigned really hard for the current slate of council people to be in office and has really come to represent what it is this council stands for, which is a backlash to the previous, more progressive city councils. Exactly what current voters' issue is with this council, I don't know, except for that I think they have taken on a lot of fights that they were not necessarily elected to take on. This council was elected very specifically as a public safety first council. And they have done a lot of that. I don't want to say that they haven't, but they have also gotten into fights over, gig work or the minimum wage and things that are actually quite popular in Seattle. And I think there is some question about their focus on the issues that they were elected to govern on. And I think what we're seeing is Sarah Nelson paying the price for that.
I have to ask, between those two races and the city council seat, I mean, these are incumbents here. What message did Seattle voters send last week?
I'll say that Alexis Mercedes Rink is also an incumbent and is doing quite well. And she's a progressive incumbent. So it's not universally an incumbent backlash, though. I will say, I don't think, Alexis Mercedes Rink is very much in the minority on this council. And so if people have problems with city government, she is not going to be the one to be blamed, because I think people are smart enough to see that she doesn't really actually have a lot of power in that position. I think the message is whatever swing we saw in 21 and 23, which came at a time of just intense kind of chaos in the city and frustration related to the pandemic and crime and the police department, we seem to be swinging back toward what I would say was the city hall of basically 2015 to 2019, even through 2020, which is, I think, probably closer to the sort of politics that people more closely associate with Seattle. It's quite left-wing. It's quite progressive. It's extremely pro-labor. It is pro kind of regulation of the relationship between landlords and tenants. There's always been a question about sort of what is the real politics of Seattle. And these results sort of suggest that the last 4 years might have been the exception, though, of course, we will get a little more clarity in the general election.
Seattle Times City Hall reporter David Kroman, really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. Today's episode was produced by Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Andy Hurst, Vaughn Jones, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you soon.